So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody here in the hall of the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology in London to this, our AGM for NHS England. It's my great pleasure as the chairman of NHS England to introduce this evening's proceedings. But before I do, what I'd like to do is to introduce individually the members of the board of NHS England. These are the people who take the decisions and who provide the leadership for the organisation. And with us tonight, and I'm going to ask each of them please to stand as I mention their names. First, the Deputy Chairman of the board, David Roberts. Thank you, David. David is also the chairman of Nationwide Building Society, brings a great deal of expertise to the deliberations of the board. Joanne Shaw, who will shortly, or has now succeeded David as chairing our Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, unfortunately is not able to be with us this evening, and she has just recently joined the board. Lord Victor Adebowale is also the Chief Executive of Turning Point and a member of the House of Lords. He brings valuable areas to our deliberations, particularly relating to marginalised communities and to mental ill health. Beside him is Sir John Byrne, globally renowned clinical geneticist and clinical scientist, innovator and inventor. Dame Moira Gibb, who is the chair of Skills for Care and also formerly the chief executive of Camden London Borough Council. Beside her, Wendy Becker. Wendy is previously has been the Chief Marketing Officer globally for Vodafone, Chief Executive of Jack Wills, and the Deputy Chair of Cancer Research UK. I'm looking for any other non-executive directors. I see Noel Gordon. Noel, please. Noel spent 26 years with Accenture in a consultancy role. He has recently taken on also the chairmanship of NHS Digital, formerly known as the Health and Social Care Information Centre. And we're delighted to have the joining up that brings to our arrangements. Michelle Mitchell, who is the Chief Executive of Multiple Sclerosis, and is an important recent member of the non-executive team. On the executive side, can I just check that I have included all the non-executives? Yes, I have. On the executive side, we have a team with, as I go along the front row, Matthew Swindells, who is the National Director for Operations and Information, joined us in May this year. As I come along here, Ian Dodge, who is our Commissioning Strategy National Director. Along next to him, Karen Wheeler, who is our Director for Transformation and Corporate Operations. I love transformation and corporate operations. Paul Baumann, our Finance Director, is unfortunately not able to be with us this evening. Jane Cummings, our Chief Nursing Officer, is here, as is Sir Bruce Keogh, our National Medical Director, and, of course, our Chief Executive, Simon Stevens. And Simon will be addressing us in the course of the evening. During the course of the past year, two non-executive directors have stood down from the board. The first was Kieran Devane, upon the expiry of his term, but also on taking on the chief executiveship of the British Council. The second was Margaret Casely-Hayford, who has taken on the chairmanship of Action Aid. We also lost Dame Barbara Haken after 41 years working in the NHS and has taken retirement, and Tim Kelsey, who has gone to Australia, first of all, to head up Telstra Health and then subsequently to take on a leading government position in Australia. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank all of those individuals for their hard work and contribution to the health of NHS England. Over the course of the year since we last gathered for an AGM, there has been a dramatic change in the political environment in which we're operating. The campaign around the referendum on the 23rd of June had as one of its key components the NHS. The slogan on the battle bus was, "We send the EU £350 million a week, let's fund our NHS instead." It was not surprising that the NHS should have played such a key role given the level of trust that it holds in the estimation of the British public. But the outcome of the referendum has had a darkening of a political mood and some chill winds growing across the landscape, not only of the nation as a whole, but also of the NHS. It's created, in many parts of the country, a growing polarization. The incidence of hate crimes has been rising, and the experience of those working within the NHS has not been immune to that subtle but quite worrying change in public opinion. It's been, of course, reflected elsewhere. This is not simply a UK phenomenon. We see similar trends emerging in France and in the US. The uncertainty has caused a dramatic change in the value of the pound, but as we know, financial markets do not like uncertainty and will discount for it. But financial markets are not in themselves super gods. Financial markets are agglomerations of individuals' preferences. And the uncertainties that affect financial markets affect all of those who work also for the National Health Service. So what is the challenge for us within the NHS? The first, I think, is to provide assurance for the 53,000 EU nationals who work for the NHS of our continued reliance and dependence and affection for the contribution that they make to the health of our organisations and to the health of our citizens. We have to appreciate that for them and for many tens of thousands of international employees who are non-EU, there is a strong relationship between their earnings in this country and the remittances which they send abroad to families, and the value of which has just dropped by 15% in the value of sterling. So our response, I would suggest, is along the three lines that follow. First, essential that we in NHS England, as an independent arm's-length body, work in close partnership with the government to provide assurance across our staff of the future of the NHS and their position in it, and to provide a counter to the uncertainty that presently prevails. Secondly, to provide stability over the coming years at a time of great change. As we'll learn this afternoon, as we look at the 5-year forward view and the work of the STPs, change must occur, and yet stability must prevail. And the stability is reinforced by having allocated our funding for the next 5 years, by having a mandate that runs for 5 years, and a clear vision of the future as an organisation. And then I think finally, to work in close partnership with the government in supporting some areas of important economic development in the United Kingdom, and most importantly, the life sciences. We have a unique agglomeration of pharmaceutical and medical devices and other investment in the UK. We have the unique position of a major single-payer health service with a capacity to work closely on medical experimentation and innovation. We have an opportunity to review the current quite restrictive EU regulation of medical experimentation and clinical trials, and an opportunity to work to advance that industry in conjunction with advancing the cause of patients and clinicians within the NHS. The Accelerated Access Review, which was announced yesterday, is a major step forward in allowing us to realise that. So our message this evening must be one not of grudging acceptance of the outcome of Brexit, but of grasping the opportunities that it gives us for the NHS and to take forward the interests of our staff and our patients at the same time. It gives me enormous pleasure now to introduce our moderator for this evening, Martha Carney. Martha.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Malcolm. And I'd just like to repeat his welcome to you all here for the annual general meeting of the NHS in England. And this is a chance to hear about the past 2 years of the 5-year forward view, about some of the new initiatives that the Health Service is working on, and how it plans to address the challenges of today and of tomorrow. And it's also a chance for all of you to ask questions. We don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm saying questions rather than speeches. Do keep it brief. I warn you, I will be brutal. And if you don't have a chance to ask your question now, by all means, you can write it on a board at the back of the room, or also on the feedback form that you should all have on your chairs. But to begin with, I'd like to invite the Chief Executive of NHS England, Simon Stevens, up here to say a few words of introduction and to discuss also NHS England's annual report and accounts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martha, and good evening or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us at this AGM. I've really got two responsibilities. One is a brief look back at the year 2015-16, last year, and then an even briefer look forward to the year we're in and the journey that the NHS is now embarked on. And that really is just going to tee up what are going to be two panels, one of which will comprise people who genuinely know what they're talking about and are leading fantastic change in our mental health services, our cancer services, our urgent and emergency care services, learning disability. And the second will be a panel of some of our most engaged local leaders trying to shape their care systems across the country that Matthew Swindells will be helping to facilitate. So looking back at last year, 2015-16, the honest assessment has to be that it was an incredibly challenging year for the National Health Service. It was challenging for our frontline staff, for nurses, GPs, A&E doctors, therapists, administrative staff. It was a year in which pressures continued to build, and that showed up as pressures on the headline goals around A&E, 4-hour attendance, waiting times for routine surgeries. But it's, without in any way detracting from that reality, I think vitally important that we recall that it is still the case that people in England are getting some of the fastest access to A&E services and planned surgery of any industrialised country in the world, for the whole country. That's the social contract that the National Health Service offers. More than 9 in 10 people last year were seen and treated in A&Es within 4 hours. More than 9 in 10 people got their planned surgery within 18 weeks, compared with the position a decade earlier when people were waiting 18 months. So real pressures on frontline staff as a result of a growing and ageing population, the resource constraints, but nevertheless an overall performance that I think we can be proud of, not least when we think about the other parts of what the health service does that are not represented in those headline measures. Those operational pressures were correspondingly represented by financial pressures. And in the absence of Paul Baumann, our Chief Financial Officer, it simply falls to me to report to you that NHS England last year met each of our financial obligations to Parliament. And for those of you interested in reviewing them in detail, I refer you to page 184 of our annual report, which is available on the NHS England website. But suffice it to say that as the accounting officer, personally the accounting officer to Parliament for the £101 billion of public money that NHS England was invested with last year, we met each of those responsibilities, we managed to our budget, and in fact we produced a planned underspend of £599 million to contribute to wider funding pressures in hospitals and in other parts of the National Health Service. What we also did, very importantly, I think, last year, was chart strategic directions for some of the big killers and disablers and health conditions in this country, and detailed blueprints as to how we're going to improve them over the next 5 years. And we did this not by retreating into a darkened room and a group of NHS folks coming up with what they felt was the answer, but instead, for the first time, by, in the jargon, co-producing this with the patients groups, the charities, the clinicians who lead our mental health services, our cancer services, learning disability services, maternity services. And as a result, we now have very clear marching orders as to what it is we've got to do across the country to raise our game on those key national priorities. This time last year at our annual general meeting, I took the unusual step of publicly commenting on the state of the negotiations between ourselves and the government on the spending review, the 5-year spending review, which was then in its final few weeks of negotiation. And I described 5 tests, 5 criteria that we would use to judge whether or not the funding available to us matched the expectations set out in the NHS 5-year forward view. And as the year has played out, we successfully got the front-loaded funding settlement for 2016-17, broadly speaking, that we were asking for. And as I've explained to the Public Accounts Committee and to the Health Select Committee, in 5 years' time, in year 5 of the spending review, we were broadly in the zone that we talked about, albeit at the lower end of the range. But terms and conditions applied. And one of those was that the country would need to continue to see well-funded social care services able to respond to increasing need for publicly funded care homes and home support. We would need to see continued progress on prevention, and we would need funding for capital investment and infrastructure, and all of those we have written on something called a recap briefing, setting out very clearly the need for those preconditions to be in place. I think it's fair to say, and we've reported to Parliament, that we don't believe all of those are yet in place. And in terms of the funding settlement that we received, again, this is not a new statement, but for the purposes of the AGM, I think it's important to recap. We did not get the funding that we requested for years 2, 3 and 4 of the 5-year spending review, namely 2017-18, 18-19 and 19-20, with the consequence that we've got a bigger hill to climb and when we think about the kinds of pressures that we'll be facing the NHS over the next 3 years. So looking forward then to the year we're in and beyond, what are the things that we at NHS England have got to get right? Well, first of all, we need to continue to work very, very closely with our national partners, with NHS Improvement, with the Care Quality Commission, with the other parts of the national architecture of the NHS, to ensure that there is a joined up and coherent approach to leadership of the task in front of the NHS as a whole, rather than the fragmented and diffuse set of responsibilities that, done badly, could be the net effect of the national architecture that we have all inherited. And I think our joint working with NHS Improvement in particular has moved forward in leaps and bounds over the course of the last year, and we need to continue to build on that. Secondly, we need to ensure that we effectively fulfil our unique legal responsibilities as stewards of the commissioning system, ensuring that local clinical commissioning groups and our national specialised commissioning responsibilities are discharged effectively. And I'm pleased to say that last year we made further progress in our specialised commissioning responsibilities, ensuring that the core budget was balanced, and we made important improvements in the way in which we are procuring cancer medicines and other services across the country. Thirdly, we need to make tangible gains on the agenda we've set ourselves on mental health services, on cancer, on support in particular for GPs and primary care, and for the broader redesign of urgent and emergency care. And that's what our 2 panels are going to help talk about. I particularly want to pay attention to and draw your attention to our work to try and improve the resilience of GP services across this country. I think we are pleased that whereas in every year prior to the existence of NHS England for almost a decade, the share of investment going into GP services was going down. In every year since the creation of NHS England, we've seen real increases in funding for GPs, and last year that was at 2 times the rate of the overall funding increase. But together with our partners at the Royal College of General Practitioners, frontline GPs, the General Practitioners Committee, we now have a very clear game plan for investment in general practice, another £2.4 billion over the next 5 years, for improvement in the staffing available, not just GPs, but also pharmacists and mental health therapists and other staff in general practice, investment in GP premises to deal with some of the infrastructure issues that are there, and a broad programme to redesign the way GP services link with hospital outpatients, community services, social care, to deal with some of the frustration on the part of both patients and general practitioners. So we've got to get the alignment right with the other national leadership bodies. We've got our stewardship responsibilities for the commissioning system. We've got to make tangible gains over the next year on our national priorities. And we have got to support, above all, the work of local leaders through, call it the sustainability and transformation plans, doesn't really matter what you call it, the process which is now underway in every part of the country to actually ensure that the NHS and our partners in local government and the third sector are coming together to chart a direction, an agreed direction, to use the funding available to produce local improvement. And that is a tremendously complex undertaking. It is in some ways countercultural to the incentives that have been in the National Health Service for at least 2 decades, with each organisation out sharp-elbowed doing its own thing. Now a realisation that actually people have got to behave in ways that are more than the sum of their parts if we're going to try and see the sorts of improvements on health and care quality and the sustainability of how we use our resources. So this is clearly a highly complex and very pressurised time in the 68-year history of the National Health Service. We have certain things going for us, namely the fact that there, broadly speaking, is an agreed direction about what health and care quality and the efficiency agenda needs to look like. But we know that time is not on our side, and actually what the people of this country want is practical improvements in ways that can be noticed and have beneficial impact, and that's what our staff are looking for as well. Often a sensation that they are succeeding despite the system, not because of it, and so it is all of our responsibilities to do what we can to enable that local change process to occur in every part of the country. So thank you again for being here this afternoon. I think we will now get straight into the first panel talking about what we're doing on mental health and cancer and some of our other national priorities. Martha.
Thank you very much